If you're talking about it, I'll be talking about it. Dennis Prager here. Join me this morning at 11, right here on AM 560, The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. Well, there were a number of interesting excerpts from Michael Wolff's book, Fire and Fury, which has created a furor inside the Beltway. And among the subjects that were discussed in the excerpts released, personnel decisions in the early days of the Trump administration, conversations alleged to have occurred between Steve Bannon and Roger Ailes, formerly the head of Fox News, was at the time, about particularly foreign policy, national security posts, including National Security Advisor. And one of the names mentioned by Ailes was former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, John Bolton. But Steve Bannon worried about his physical appearance.
Like Steve Bannon should be talking.
Well,
now he's sloppy Steve.
Steve Bannon,
according to President Trump's tweets.
I don't think Steve Bannon was up for NSA, but Bannon suggested that John Bolton didn't look the part, according to the president, because of the signature mustache.
The mustache makes the man.
Okay.
Please.
Well, John Bolton obviously thinks that, and we're pleased to be joined by our friend, former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, John Bolton. Ambassador Bolton, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Yeah, another wonderful morning, right?
Yeah. Hey, how are you doing?
Nobody likes to be, criticized about their fashion sense, yours truly included. But how did you react to that excerpt? Or did you kind of laugh at it, or did it ring true to you?
At this point, what else are you going to do? And I just want to say, for those of you who watch the Kennedy show on the Fox Business Network, comes on normally in the 8 o'clock hour. I was on last night, and Kennedy gave a rousing endorsement to my mustache.
All right.
So I told her I'm sure that would stand me in good stead with the president.
Well, I mean, if she endorses it, then I say you keep it.
Right. What else do you need to know, right?
So, but, I mean, do you think that you didn't get the position because President Trump does not like facial hair? And we're not dealing.
I don't think so. People should remember his father had a mustache. So unless you're, deeply into Freudian stuff, I think this is all urban myth at this point.
All right. Enough mustache talk.
Silliness
It's too heavy to continue on this stuff.
Yeah, we'll get to the reason we have you on is what's going on between your ears and your knowledge of geopolitical matters. So let's start with Iran and what you think the prospects are for, to borrow a phrase, regime change in Iran with the protests that are rolling through the streets, and not just of Tehran.
Well, it's a very significant development what's happening in Iran, and something that I think is a direct threat to the regime of the Ayatollahs. I think this is very different than what was called the Green Movement in 2009, when they were protesting the obviously fraudulent presidential election that kept Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in office. There, the protest was just which candidate of the regime would take over. There's no opposition to the regime as such, or at least none that was publicly visible. What we see now in these demonstrations, which have taken place by most accounts in over 100 cities across Iran, is they are chanting precisely death to Khamenei, the supreme leader, down with the regime. Now, this particular round of demonstrations may end, it may be repressed, but a line has been crossed here, and I think the regime is in trouble. I think it's much more fragile than its international appearance. I mean, you've got decades of economic mismanagement. I think that's really where these demonstrations got started. You've got nearly 70% of the population is under 30. They know they could lead a very different life. They can see it across the Gulf and Doha, Dubai, and Abu Dhabi. They see it on the internet. And there's enormous tension within the different ethnic groups in Iran. Persians are only 50% of the population. So there's a lot going on, and as I say, whatever happens with the current round of demonstrations, I think this is torqued up to a new level of threat to the regime.
Do you think that President Trump, though, should have inserted himself and supporting the protesters in his tweets?
Absolutely. I think, number one, it was important to show yet again that Barack Obama is no longer president. A lot of people in foreign countries don't know anything about the American political system. No reason that they should. They sort of assume one president's pretty much like another. That's obviously not the case as we understand, but I think it is important for the president to stand up and be clear about where the sympathies of our country lie. And there's a direct analogy to some of the very strong statements that Ronald Reagan made about the Soviet Union during the last days of the Cold War, when he called the Soviet Union the evil empire. Natan Sharansky and other dissidents inside prison camps, many of them in the Soviet Union, said they heard Reagan, they heard other statements like that, and it gave them strength. It lifted their morale. It said somebody on the outside understands what we're going through here, and it gave them, helped them increase the will to continue. It boosted their courage. So I think it's important that he did it, and I think it was the right thing to do.
The president is taking some heat this week for a tweet about how big his button is with respect to Kim Jong-un's button in North Korea. A little bit of hysteria from the D.C. press corps. That's nothing new, suggesting he's engaged in nuclear brinkmanship. I thought the tweet was a little kind of gratuitous and unnecessary. But the larger point about the Trump administration's position on North Korea, consistent with the principled realist approach they're taking to geopolitics?
Well, I think that the Trump administration inherited some very bad options from its predecessors. North Korea has made enormous progress toward having the capability to deliver thermonuclear weapons to any target they want, really around the world, but obviously particularly in the United States. So he's had to try in a very short period of time to identify policies that will put a lot more pressure on North Korea, whether through China or greater sanctions. I don't think North Korea is ever going to voluntarily give up its nuclear weapons program, especially given how close it is to achieving something it's been after for 30 years. If we weren't able to pressure them or talk them out of the program during that 30-year period, why does anybody think in the last 6, 9, 12 months they're certainly going to say, we got 99% of the way there, but I guess we'll stop now? It's not going to happen. So unless you're prepared to see North Korea with nuclear weapons forever, you've got some pretty tough options you've got to look at. Not that anybody wants to see military force used, but just think about what it's like to live in a world where Kim Jong-un does have his finger on the button, and beyond that can sell his nuclear technologies to Iran, to terrorist groups, to other would-be aspiring nuclear powers. So, it's a desperate situation with respect to the threat of North Korea, but it also represents potentially the crashing and burning of 50 years or more of American counterproliferation policy, the effort to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, because North Korea's success here would prove that if you just have the determination and the patience, you too can be a nuclear weapon state. That's a very bad lesson to be learned around the world.
Well, we have the Olympics in about 32 days. They begin, and that hotline between North and South Korea has been reopened, and they have a big conversation coming up January 9th. Do you think the Olympics could help lead to any type of denuclearization?
No, this is complete propaganda. And remember, in 2000 and 2004, the North and South Korean Olympic teams marched together under one flag, as I recall, during the presidential administrations in South Korea of Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, two presidents who had the same view. They called it the sunshine policy, isn't that sweet, about how to deal with North Korea. And it failed then, and it will fail now. The reason I think the North has opened this up is to distract attention, so that now people talk about, the Olympic Games. In the meantime, their nuclear scientists and their ballistic missile technicians are working overtime to complete what they need to do to have that delivery capability. So, this is a bait and switch kind of affair for the North Koreans. They've got it in their playbook. They roll it out whenever they need to, and we shouldn't be suckered by it.
Just thinking about the first year of the Trump administration and their essentially encyclical describing the principled realist approach to foreign policy. Essentially reducing the budget of the UN, pulling back foreign aid to Pakistan, supporting freedom protesters in Iran, marginalizing ISIS, new sanctions on Russia. For all of the talk about feckless foreign policy, or he's out in over his depth with respect to all of these complicated international matters, seems like that actually there is sort of a consistent thread that's emerging, consistent with how they've described their approach to all of these countries, whether they're allies of convenience or open, hostile countries. And I just wonder what your kind of general assessment of the administration and his national security team is a year in.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long list of things recognizing Jerusalem as, as Israel's capital. And the national security statement, as you mentioned. All of these things, I think, are in the mainstream of conservative Republican foreign policy. So, you get the media that gets its hair on fire each morning with a couple tweets that come out when, if you look at, as you say, almost exactly a year's worth of policy, and it would be hard to distinguish, I think, what Trump is doing in the White House from what Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, Jeb Bush would have done in the White House. So, it's hard not to kind of react when the media gets on a tear. But I'm steeling myself. I'm working on my self-discipline just to continue to ignore what the mainstream media say and just actually focus on real events in the real world, not what's in the newspapers or on NBC, ABC, and CBS.
A good New Year's resolution for us all. He is former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. Ambassador Bolton, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Oh, great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
The story.